Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dania Khatib, and I'm an affiliated scholar at the Issam Faris Institute. I have the pleasure this afternoon to discuss a very important issue, which is the Caesar Act and its effect on Lebanon. The day before yesterday, we had a similar session where we discussed the Caesar Act effect on Syria. So this is part 2 of our webinar series on Caesar Act. And today we have 3 very distinguished scholars who will discuss the issue with us. We have Mr. Nicholas Harris, and he's from the Institute of Study of War in DC, and he handles Syria, Iraq, and the Islamic State. And we have also with us Mr. William Wilshire. He's the director of the Rafiq Hariri Center for Middle East Program at the Atlantic Council in Washington. And we have with us Ms. Dorothy Schmidt. Dorothy handles Turkey and Middle East at the IFRI, Institut Français des Relations Internationales, which is a very prominent French think tank in international affairs. I just want to remind our audience about, just to give them a very short brief about the Caesar Act, those who do not know it. A few years back, one of the officers of the Assad army, he was in charge of taking pictures of the courts that had been subject to torture. He defected from Assad army and went to the US, and he had with him 55 pictures that were authenticated. And based on that, the new law, a new act, was signed. I mean, it was signed by the president in December last year, and it came into effect in June this year, 2020, 17 June. The Caesar Act came into to be enforced. The Caesar Act renders the Assad regime responsible for violence against citizens. That's why it's called Citizen Protection Act. Why are we discussing Lebanon? The Caesar Act is not directed towards Lebanon, but since Lebanon and Syria and the two systems are very well interconnected, the Caesar Act will have repercussions on Lebanon. And this is what we are going to discuss today. And I'll start with Nicholas. Nicholas, what do you think, Nick, will be the repercussions of the Caesar Act on Lebanon? And first, I want 2 things. I want you to tell me 2 things. What were the intended effect? You know what, when the US did put this act together, what did they have in mind for Lebanon, and what do you think its expected effect will be on Lebanon?
Well, thank you, Danya, and thank you to the Issam Faris Institute for hosting this important webinar, and to all my panelist peers. I appreciate this opportunity. You know, the Caesar sanctions are intended to prevent the Assad regime and its allies, particularly Iran and Russia, but also other actors, whether in the Arab world or corporate companies based in other parts of the world, such as in Europe or anywhere really, to benefit from the reconstruction of Syria. There are certain core industries that are targeted by the Caesar sanctions, particular real estate development, which includes the reconstruction piece of this, the petroleum industry, the energy industry, the aviation industry. And fundamentally, it's meant to close off pathways to allow the regime to benefit from the atrocities that it has committed in order to put itself in a militarily stronger position in the Syrian conflict. Lebanon isn't the intended target of these sanctions, as you pointed out, but Lebanon, as has been described by the administration, is the lung of Syria, and in many ways the lung of the regime. Lebanese banks have provided an avenue for billions of dollars to be deposited by Syrians of all sectors of Syrian society, but there are also regime officials that have sought to use Lebanon as a pass-around in order to avoid sanctions. Lebanon is also key strategic depth for the Assad regime. The role that Hezbollah has played in supporting the regime and using Lebanese territory from which to support military activities that have consolidated the regime's control over areas of Western Syria, notably the battle around Qusair, in 2013, which for all intents and purposes closed off the Syrian armed opposition's pathway to use Lebanon as a base from which to seize control of Damascus. So Lebanon is extremely important in this context. Lebanon was also floated as one potential hub for reconstruction of Syria. The Tripoli port, for example, was posited as one place by which international reconstruction support, whether through the private sector or through the international community, could be funneled into Syria. So there are two main consequences that I see of the Caesar sanctions moving forward. First, the pathway for Assad and his allies to use Lebanon to support reconstruction and redevelopment that's dominated by the regime becomes much more difficult. It becomes more difficult for the regime to use Lebanese banks, but also individuals who are Lebanese or entities, companies, and other entities that are Lebanese to support reconstruction. And in that context, there does create enormous uncertainty as to how Lebanon can find industries that can allow it to get out of the economic morass that it is currently in a situation that has gone worse. The second element, which is less commented on, but which is important, is it also provides a potential opportunity for the Lebanese armed forces to really take control of the border regions, particularly in northern and eastern Syria. There has been intense investment from the United States, the United Kingdom, and some other European partners in the Lebanese armed forces capabilities through the Lebanese armed forces land border regiments and the construction of watchtowers and patrols to cut down on smuggling between Syria and Lebanon. There are at least 160 known smuggling routes that are used by average people between Lebanon and Syria because how close some communities are on the border, but also by Hezbollah. And I think this is the special target, is that if Hezbollah is able to create permanent and habitual crossings between Syria and Lebanon, it provides it with more power. And so one of the secondary effects of the sanctions is how do you give more power to the Lebanese armed forces to be more active in preventing smuggling that Hezbollah can benefit from and that the regime can benefit from. So those are the two major effects that I see.
I just want a small clarification, Nick. You say it will empower the Lebanese, the LAF, to control the crossings. But you know, the military is subordinate to the civilian. So the military don't take decision on their own to close crossings or to open crossings. So I don't understand how it is supposed to empower the military.
So what it can do is this renewed focus on preventing the Syrian regime from benefiting from reconstruction and benefiting from activities such as the smuggling of Lebanese state-subsidized fuel and flour, two very important commodities that are being taken away from the Lebanese people and are being smuggled across the border into Syria, which helped the regime. This emphasis on cutting down on smuggling routes and this emphasis on cutting down on activities that may be conducted by Lebanese actors that support the regime and its reconsolidation in Syria can then potentially create that pressure for civilian authorities to say, this is in the best interest for Lebanon, for us to create actual barriers between the two countries.
Okay. Well, that's what you're saying, but you have voices in Lebanon who are saying, actually, because of Caesar, instead of cutting the routes to Damascus, we have to head east. So what do you think about that? Well, so basically, some people in Lebanon, they have the totally opposite narrative that now that there is Caesar and there is sanction and we're going to be hit by sanction, it's better to go and look east and just forget about the west. What do you think about that, William? Will Caesar make the Lebanese look at the east? I mean, the east, which means Syria. Is there anything like substantial Lebanon can benefit from in Syria?
The short answer to that is no, but let me give you a little longer answer to that. First, it must be said that the economic and financial crisis that is confronting Lebanon and Syria right now is not the result of the Caesar Act. It's not the result of actions that the United States has been doing or any other country is doing. it is the fault of a long series of decisions over many decades by leaders in both Lebanon and in Syria about how they want to structure their economy. It's about corruption, it's about mismanagement. And in Lebanon, it's above and all about the role that Hezbollah has played to prevent Lebanon from becoming a normal state. This is not the opinion of the United States. This is the opinion of the entire international community. This is why the IMF negotiations are being held up, because Lebanon is refusing to go along with the widespread consensus of the international community on these fundamental questions about how the economy is structured. That point needs to be said first. Many people in Lebanon, some of them who have vested interests in the status quo, will try to create a different narrative and try to blame others and try to use it as an excuse to make policy decisions about going east as they want to. But these are the fundamental realities. And the reality is, as far as I can tell, the people of Lebanon understand this very well. And that's amongst the reasons why they've been on the streets in the past years. That's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to say was that Syria has been under US sanctions, of course, for a long time, as far as the law has, since 1979. Caesar itself was under discussion for years and has very strong bipartisan support in the United States. It's not directed at the Lebanese economy, but as Nicholas was saying, its purpose is to dissuade individuals and companies from participating in the Syrian, Russian, Iranian war crimes and human rights abuses in Syria, and also to prevent people from cooperating with Syrian government-led reconstruction efforts, should they ever happen. The third thing I wanted to mention was that Caesar is a tool for the US policy. It's not a mandate. There were actually very few specific entities that were listed in the bill itself. It's a tool for the United States legislative branch has provided for the U.S. executive branch to push its policy. So there's a lot of open questions about how this is going to be enforced going forward. The last thing I want to mention is the implications for Lebanon, and going back to your question. It is, quite frankly, right now a bit of an open question about what that implementation would be, and then what the full-on implications for Lebanon will be. But what you can definitely say is that the worst thing that Lebanese leaders can do, absolutely the worst thing, is to try to ignore the Caesar Act, is try to ask the rest of the world to shield Lebanon somehow from the impacts of Caesar.
Yes.
To try to normalize relationships with Syria, to look to China as some kind of savior. All of these kinds of actions continue the long-standing pattern of refusal to focus on creating the political will necessary to deal with the underlying structural issues of the Lebanese economy. There's been hope for a long time that all the money that's going to come through from some fantasy degree of reconstruction in Syria through the Lebanese banks that's going to solve the problem. And so it's going to be another Deus ex machina that's going to come in and save Lebanon. No one can save Lebanon but the Lebanese people and the Lebanese leaders. And that is what the IMF is trying to do, is trying to force these questions on. The immediate repercussions will be on enhanced due diligence by the private sector. It's not a matter of government policy, but if you're a foreign bank, the Caesar Act is there, you're going to be asking questions about your Lebanese counterparts and correspondent accounts about the nature of the underlying business behind some of these accounts. If you're a Lebanese bank, you need to start you're doing enhanced due diligence. They all remember what happened to Jamal Trust Bank and Lebanese Canadian Bank. But the targets are not the Lebanese economy. Now, we've only seen the first list of designations from the US government. It's a relatively short list and a relatively straightforward list. I expect it to be implemented further as the years continue. But if I was the ones that were going to be most nervous about this, I would be nervous if I was a Russian company very much engaged in the human rights abuses that are targeted. if I was a Lebanese person that was working with those Russian companies. I would be worried if I was European or Gulf companies that were interested in working towards reconstruction. If I was Hezbollah, I would be especially concerned. They are losing the argument in Europe, as we've seen with the German ban. If I was a smuggler involved in that work, I would be very worried. Those would be the people that would be much more under the microscope going forward.
Thank you, William. I'll go back to you about people who are to be sanctioned. But now I want to go to Dorothy, and I want to ask her about something that William mentioned, that the Lebanese should not be asked to be shielded from Caesar Act, and that's exactly what they've asked for. You know, the Prime Minister Hassan Diab, he was late last month, there was in Brussels 4, which is for the refugee, for Syria, that was in Brussels, held in Brussels, and the prime ministers of the countries that have most of the refugees were present, and he gave a speech, and he specifically told the European, we are ready to cooperate on the issue of the refugee, but we want to be shielded from Caesar Act. And he mentioned Caesar Act. So I want to ask Dorothy, first of all, Europe, like we see now, Germany has considered Hezbollah, and it didn't before, that is a terrorist organization. When we say European policy, how does the European policy comes together? How do we reach a consensus? You know, European Union has so many countries. And second, let's say Europe wants to shield Lebanon from Caesar Act because of many considerations, one of them that Lebanon has over 1 million refugees. Is it able to do so?
So I think my part as representing the European Union is usually very easy, because it's like we cannot come together on any, common position. And even if there is a sort of consensus on what should be done, we never manage to agree on implementing any decision, etc. So and I think it's even worse now in this COVID-19 period. Like some countries have been hit very hard in Europe. It's also the case in the US, but I think probably from the Middle East, you see things a little bit differently, because you're not going into this very deep social and political crisis that's been provoked by the complete incapacity to face the pandemics. So you have to realize that there's a sort of inward movement in every EU country by now. The common governance is going very low, except when we think on issues like rescuing the EU by itself, etc. We're also affected by the Brexit very hard. And so when you discuss the Middle East, it's not only about matters of principles, it's not only about economic solidarity, it's also about strategic issues, the security of Europe. And then historically, you always had 3 countries who were on the front and who worked together on every issue in the Middle East, and they were the UK, Germany, and France. Now with the Brexit, the UK is kind of deactivated for some time. France and Germany are working together on rescuing the EU economically. France has its own stakes regionally, and it's playing bilateral with every country. You can see now it in this sort of final role with Turkey over what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean and Libya. And so France and Germany do not necessarily converge in their interest and their strategic outlook about the region. So I see it very difficult to raise the issue of Lebanon, which is considered as a sub issue, of the Syria issue, of the refugee issue. It's not such a prominent part of the file that we all have to gather and discuss it. I mean, the last General Affairs Council was about Turkey. It was all about Turkey. And you can consider that Turkey is like also one single actor, protagonist of the whole crisis, and it does not deserve a whole EU Affairs Council to focus on. But actually, it is what has happened. So Lebanon for now is very low in the priority of the EU countries, even of France. And as you can see on the ambivalence of Jean-Yves Le Drian, our foreign affairs minister's discourse about Lebanon, like he expressing his concern, but not engaging in any direction. So announcing that he would be visiting Lebanon, but doesn't say a word about what he actually wants to do. So the EU has institutional political crisis in terms of securities, and we have the refugee issue. But if you think about the refugee issue, the one country we work with is Turkey again. Like, you know, the European Commission, sorry, has spared to spend on refugee humanitarian help to Syrian refugees in the region that has to be shared between the countries. But of course, the big chunk is for Turkey again. So Lebanon is like not considered into this big picture that we all have in mind, taking into consideration that we're very much inward looking at present. I think the other issues we'll be discussing later, but of course, the one level that this Lebanese issue, the Caesar Act issues, the Lebanese inclusion into the Caesar Act perimeter, the one story is geopolitical, of course. The right level is geopolitics. And the EU is not about geopolitics currently.
Okay. You mentioned about the French policy. We'll go to that later. I'm interested to know if there is a French policy different from European policy, but we'll talk about it later. I want to go back to William when you talk about sanctioning people. You know, sanctioning people, Hezbollah has been sanctioned, and as you mentioned, the Lebanese Canadian Bank, and you mentioned Jamal Trust Bank because they had accounts for Hezbollah. So we've had some sanction for a while, but now with the Caesar Act, and every time before the Caesar Act, you know, we had David Schenker, the assistant secretary, he was going in the media and say there will be more sanction for Hezbollah allies. So now with the Caesar Act, do you expect like more sanction on Hezbollah allies, like Free Patriotic Movement and Amal Movement? Do you think they will go there, they will sanction them, or they will keep some door open with the allies of Hezbollah?
Well, it's unclear right now what the Trump administration will do, and it's even more unclear if the Trump administration will be reelected, and if not, then what the Biden administration will do. But I do think, as a general point, there will be a wider degree of focus, a higher degree of focus in the United States policymaking apparatus on sanctioning entities that are under the Caesar bill. There is a requirement for regular notifications to the Congress and reports to the Congress. No administration wants to be in a position where they say that they've been doing nothing as a result of this new authority that's been given. And it fundamentally will depend on the actions that the Lebanese government is taking. Again, as I said, these are policy tools.
Like what?
Well, if the Lebanese government is perceived to be moving in the right direction, coming to an agreement with the IMF, trying to distance itself from the Syrian regime, trying to cut down on the smuggling routes, trying to make sure that its banking institutions conduct professional level international standards of due diligence to make sure that they are not abetting criminal and other bad actors in the world. If they're working in that direction, then I would imagine that the sanctions would be very targeted against those individual entities that are outside of the government control that are trying to get around the government control. If the Lebanese government decides the other way, if the Lebanese government decides not to operate like a normal country and try to enforce these kinds of rules and regulations and try to crack down on smuggling, but instead does what you said at the beginning, we are going to go in the exact opposite direction. We are going to try to deny that the Caesar bill affects us at all. We are going to not only are we going to not try to control these things through our financial system and through our laws and regulations, but we are going to actively turn east and build an economy. You know, I've heard some of these you know, narratives that says we should have a bubble of a sanctioned economy with Lebanon and Syria and Iran together, and we should normalize relations. These are disastrous, potentially, decisions for Lebanon. And in those types of situations, I would imagine that any US administration would have to consider having much more wide-ranging sanctions.
Well, the Lebanese government is trying to go around the sanctions. For example, they've met with a delegation from Iraq and to do kind of barter, that they give us fuel and we give them agricultural products. So this is starting, and there was a meeting with the Chinese ambassador to see. I mean, the Chinese are now have a big reconstruction plan with Iran, so why not with Lebanon? So they are starting. You have a bit of this coming, but whether the point is whether it will be successful or not. Nick?
Yeah, if I can just say just very quickly on China, Lebanese interest in China vastly exceeds China's interest in Lebanon. And anybody in Lebanon that holds out hopes that China is the solution to their immediate problems is at the very least lying in the public, but probably lying to themselves, you know, as well. China is both not inclined to solve the Lebanese problem and not capable of solving the Lebanese problem. Let's just give one example. As you said, there's been leaks of a potential agreement between China and Iran recently for a large degree of investment.
280 billion.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see exactly what it is. China and Iran struck a comprehensive strategic partnership, which is the top of their 5 levels of partnerships that China has, back in 2016. This has been under negotiation ever since that point. China has has strategic partnerships with Iraq and Jordan. China does not have either a strategic partnership nor a comprehensive strategic partnership with Lebanon or with Syria. It is way far behind in the process that China uses to make these kinds of deals. So even if China was inclined, which the last thing that China wants to do is become a major player inside of the interminable problems of domestic politics inside of Lebanon. But even if China was inclined, there's no way that the time frame for any Chinese engagement addresses Lebanese current immediate needs. Those current immediate needs have to be solved by the current Lebanese people and leadership right now.
Okay, one of the problems, thank you, William. One of the problems was smuggling. And I want to go back to Nick about the smuggling. You mentioned smuggling. You know, it's no longer a secret, the smuggling. Before there were talks about it, but then, you know, MTV, which is a Lebanese channel, they did the whole documentary about it. They put it on TV, and you have footage of all these trucks taking the flour and taking the fuel. So in this case, who will be sanctioned? Because can you say, can you know who is to be sanctioned, for example? Because they are going to the Assad regime, they are going to Syria.
Well, I think this is a great point, and I'll start by sort of building on what William and Dorothy has said, because I think this is important. We widen the aperture. When you discuss sort of Lebanon and its role in this broader resistance economy that's conjured up from Iran, that, as William pointed out, includes Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, that would find a great power alternative to the United States and to the European Union. So again, this is the idea of China using all its cash and all of its influence to sort of power the engine of this resistance economic bloc that would stretch across the core Middle East, with Russia providing strategic military assets and also another great power input. And this is something you see not just from Lebanese actors, but also you see, for example, in Iraq, You have Iraqi actors also saying, we need to pivot to China, and we need to pivot to China hard. And so I think this is an interesting dynamic, because one of the sort of discussions that you have here in Washington, not just in Washington, in Lebanon, for example, is Lebanon a particular province of Syria, and which Syria? Because part of the secondary, tertiary effects of the sanctions, but not only just the sanctions, also sort of the economic pressure that has developed in Syria and Lebanon over the last year and a half, does this create the space for Lebanese actors that do not want to be wedded and tied into Syria at the hip, to literally be the lun of the Assad regime, as it's referred to? Does this give them space to separate? The smuggling issue is tied into that. Now, we know smuggling is something that has occurred across the Lebanese-Syrian border for years and years and years. This is all one cultural space, right? Is one cultural space with Syria. This has happened. Communities that lie on the border often would go into Syria for less expensive goods, whether they were medicines or they were other items. You'd have, in the past, before the Syrian civil war, you'd have luxury consumer goods that would be taken from Syria into Lebanon because they were cheaper, which would deny the Lebanese state, the ability to have customs revenues on that. So this has been a long-standing challenge. I think there's a interesting emphasis now that we're in this sort of Caesar sanctions era about, okay, individuals are going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult to use Caesar sanctions to sanction a group of smugglers who happen to be natives of Arsal, for example. It's going to be difficult to do that. So instead, Caesar is an interesting tool, as William pointed out, because it looks more at industries than it does at entities per se and individuals per se, and it says, okay, how do we try to prevent support into certain commanding heights industries that the Assad regime and its allies, of which Hezbollah is a prominent one, will try to use to benefit from the conflict. And so I think, when we talk about smuggling, it would be more in the concept of, there are certain things that we don't want to see. We don't want to see fuel. We don't want to see $400 million worth of fuel being smuggled into regime-held areas that regime-led entities that are tied to human rights abuses and crimes against humanity will then use to support their power. We don't want to see that. So we will look for syndicates that may try to do that, but more appropriately, we may look for ways to close that channel, or look for ways to use the sanctions as political pressure for Lebanese politicians, or alternatively, the Lebanese people themselves, to ask for better border controls. I think that what is interesting in Lebanon that we've seen emerge over the last year is when you see the sort of popular wellspring of anger, pan-sectarian, across sectarian lines, across class lines, about good governance, about reducing corruption, about creating a society that benefits all rather than certain particular interests. There's that sort of momentum that may be tapped that could come as an effect of the Caesar sanctions, not right away, but over time. And fundamentally, when you look at the smuggling, if you can create the conditions to empower the LAF and to empower the government to use the LAF and other tools at its disposal to stop that, then that can be potentially positive effects.
So I want to again ask you, so the Caesar Act can coerce the government to hold them responsible for border control?
Coerce would be a strong way of putting it. Yeah. I would say that it could provide a motivation. For the Lebanese act. And again, the Caesar, as has been laid out, the Caesar sanctions don't target Lebanon. But what they do is they have secondary and tertiary effects, of which reduces Lebanon's role as a lun for the Assad regime.
Well, now I want to go to William about the borders again. Do you think, like now with the Caesar Act, we will have some incentive to apply 1701? To put the UN, the UNIFIL, on the eastern border of Lebanon?
I'm a little skeptical that will, at the end of the day, be the solution. I think that, it's a mixed experience of the effectiveness of UNIFIL on the border that it is dealing with. There's a mixed appetite at the UN for taking on a different mission. The easier or more immediate question is, can the Lebanese armed forces have the political will behind them by the leadership in Lebanon to start managing some of these checkpoints and some of these transit routes and some of these smuggling lines that Hezbollah has been managing itself. It's a fundamental question for the sovereignty of the Lebanese country and the sovereignty of its national institutions. And, it would be a more productive way forward for Lebanon to approach it in that way than by Lebanon looking for yet another external actor to try to solve and address what is fundamentally an internal political problem.
So what are the incentives to push for that? There was recently a report by the Republican committee in the Congress, and one of the suggestion was to decrease the funding of the LAF. So what would be the incentive to push? I mean, it's not the LAF, you want to push the civilian authority behind the LAF for more better border control.
Right. As Nicholas was saying, the part of the incentives is in how the United States ends up deploying the Caesar Act and what kinds of entities might be considered to be sanctioned under this. When these kinds of sanction regimes work well, it's not a matter of just putting out designations, but it's a matter of using the leverage inherent in these to help encourage other actors, mainly, by the way, in the private sector, non-governmental actors, but also government actors, to take decisions that would prevent such sanctions from being imposed in the first place. And so those kinds of discussions will undoubtedly be happening. The other question the other question that's immediately raised by what you just identified is internal dynamics political dynamics inside the United States. Just as Dorothy said about the European Union, and she said, I have no doubt accurately, that the future of Lebanon is a secondary or tertiary issue in the current context for the top decision makers in the European Union. Lebanon is not much higher in the United States political dynamic. It's seen to be a country where only bad news emanates from, where there's a never-ending set of problems. That is not the perspective of the professionals in the United States, in the executive branch and the legislative branch who work on Lebanon on a day-to-day basis, who understand the complexities and importance of Lebanon. But if you're a political actor in the United States, you think the President Trump has said, let's get out of this whole region of the Middle East. You want to save money, and this is money that's being spent. And you're having people tell them very simplistically that, hey, the LAF is swarmed by Hezbollah. That Hezbollah has infiltrated the LAF. That Hezbollah, because of its impact on the wider political system, controls what the LAF can do. The LAF cannot cannot enforce the sovereignty of the country. So why should the U.S. taxpayers be spending money on such an entity? This is the argument that you hear, and this is the argument that you see reflected in this Republican policy committee. I think that argument is mistaken. I think that the U.S. and European support for the LAF is a generational long effort to reinforce Lebanese sovereignty first and foremost, but that message will get louder and louder, especially if the political leaders in Lebanon continue to refuse to take the hard decisions necessary to both improve their economy and drive and enhance their own sovereignty. So that is one of the longer term incentives that the United States and then Europe is putting in front of not just the left, but the wider political policy elite inside of Lebanon.
So you think this argument might pan out, you know, that though that the LAF is the only functional institution in the country, do you think it has a chance to pan out?
I think it has a chance to pan out. The question is, what are the decisions? You know, there were people, again, 5+ years ago, when they first put the Caesar Act or its predecessor up in the American Congress, it didn't get the support necessary to move forward. In the interim, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah committed so many horrible atrocities inside of Syria that there more and more legislators in the United States came to support of what became the Caesar Act. So what caused that? What caused that was the actions on the field by the adversaries who decided to ignore this as a problem set, and now they end up with the Caesar Act. If the Lebanese political leadership wants to look at what the Republican Policy Committee recently did and said, oh, it's just a small thing, it's not reflected in law right now, it's not something that we need to consider because we talked to people in the State Department and the Defense Department who say the opposite, and so we can just ignore this. The problem with that kind of approach is 5 years from now,
it might happen.
It might happen. It might happen if they have given the United States no reason to go otherwise. People like me will lose the argument who want to continue the relationship with the LAF if I can't say that the LAF is doing anything to promote our common interests in preventing these kinds of atrocities in Syria and supporting the Assad regime.
Thank you, William. William, you said, like Dorothy said, that Lebanon is not that important. You said it's not that important. She even said for France is not exactly important. But, you know, Lebanese look up at France. They look at it, they said the tender mom, you know, al Hanoun at France. And we feel that Lebanon is important for France. So can you tell us, Lebanon for France, not for the European, what is it as like in the puzzle, which we call, let's say if we have a puzzle called Middle Eastern policy, where is the place of Lebanon? Where is the place? How much Lebanon has weight in the overall French Middle East policy?
So first, I wanted to make another point about the previous question about the potential EU consensus on the Caesar Act and how it's been, the parameters being enlarged to other countries than Syria. And I suppose there's a parallel I suppose you Lebanese would draw a parallel with what happened after the failure of the JCPOA and the reinforcement of sanctions on Iran, because after all, it's part of the same system of sanctions. And there was a lot of hope that the EU would bring an alternative to the US system of sanctions, that they would oppose what was perceived as an arbitrary or abusive move from the US. But you have to realize that we never managed to actually oppose clearly the US system, and we all have to abide by it. And so if you consider that this Caesar affair with Lebanon is again a sort of sub-file, a small story within the big one, I think there are very little chances that we come together with an alternative, and that there is a diplomatic capacity to actually propose this alternative, especially as we are now in a context where sanctions are being generalized as a very offensive tool for every power who wants to have a hand in the Middle East. And what to me is very relevant is the idea that the US and the EU have their own system of sanctions. The US are always one step beyond. They're going further. They're stronger. They're more offensive. Like we in the EU have a sort of passive, a sort of a soft use of sanctions, and the US have a very offensive use of sanctions. But in the end, they win because they're on the top of the pyramid. So so I think it's very difficult for us to keep our own system of sanctions and make it appear as a softer or as an alternative system to the US one. So that was a point that I think was important to make, because on Syria, the idea is we want to freeze the political situation until the agreement between the different parties do much more or less our own political objectives of an inclusive solution, or sort of we need a post-conflict solution. We don't want restoration. We don't want basic restoration in Syria, which is actually what's happening. And sanctions were just supposed to be a tool to freeze the situation for the EU. But for the US, it has become a regime change instrument by now, I think. So we're going really further, and it's very difficult for us to counter this. Then about your question on where Lebanon stands in the French priorities in the Middle East, I think we've all said that Lebanon has lost some of its geopolitical value. It used to be a sort of geopolitical asset. The French valued it a lot because they had this, it was a historical anchor for the French, but they were playing this sectarian system very much. And they got extremely confused when their traditional allies, the Lebanese community, came closer to the Hezbollah, split, or became more difficult to, their geopolitical vision became more and more difficult to accommodate or to understand for the French. And this brought a lot of confusion to how we look at Lebanon. And then under President Chirac, there was, of course, this rapprochement with the Hariri system, and the idea that the French should go more pro-Sunni because it was the future of the Middle East, because they were the majority, and because there needed to be a balancing act in favor of the Sunnis. And then now we're in the middle of this, moving between the three communities, because we also know that the Shia are so important because of the Syrian crisis. And that our current ambassador in Lebanon was formerly posted in Iran. And it has been perceived also as a sort of a gesture for the French in favor of a new equilibrium, taking more into account the Shia interest also inside Lebanon. So I think we're being very confused in this new search for allies inside Lebanon. And we cannot reconcile this with our priorities in Syria, which were recently the fight against ISIS. And that was, the only very clear, definite, precisely defined goal of the French diplomacy in Syria. And all for the rest, we've been very ambivalent. We've been moving, forward and back on do we discuss with Bashar al-Assad or not? Do we authorize reconstruction or not? What do we do about the refugees? But the only point where we had a very clear position, the only thing that we knew what we were doing in Syria was actually the fight against ISIS. So now that we said, okay, ISIS has been defeated, and at the same time, Bashar is now having the hold on Syria, it's becoming a problem, because we see there's this parcelization, there's this compartmentalization of Syria that we actually have an interest in maintaining, because we don't want this full restoration. So now we also have this difficulty to come together with our allies, not only inside the EU, but the US. And there we come to the issue of sanctions again. How do we accommodate the Trump administration's sometimes erratic decisions on the Middle East? How do we internalize the idea that the US basically want to withdraw the Middle East, and their main relay was again Turkey. And the French are now in a very strong diplomatic role with Turkey. They're very confrontational currently. So we don't want to be on the forefront. We don't want to appear as giving a direction. This is why, again, Jean-Yves Le Drian is talking about Lebanon, but what he says is only expressing concerns about the potentiality of a new civil war in Lebanon, encouraging the political elites to take their responsibilities, to go for more accountability, etc. And we clearly are not saying that we are going to revive all the financial process that we started with the CEDR conference, which is actually the point. We started with the economy, and I fully agree with William that CESAR is not the problem of the Lebanese economy. Lebanese economy was already collapsing. I mean, CESAR is only, you know, another small nail in the coffin. But I mean, it's not, the whole problem is not about CESAR. We knew it before. We've been struggling for 2 years to try and convince the international institution to commit more to Lebanon. And on the other side, we've been trying to force the political elite to express firm commitment and to realize more reforms and to go for austerity programs. And it's not working. So we've basically give up. We give up, and we don't want to appear as the ones, as the Deus Ex Machina again for Lebanon. Like even like in 2018, the CEDR conference was a surprise to everybody. Why should we again invest on that country where nothing is ever working? Well, basically because we were still searching for an influence point in the Middle East. And I think now we're more on the retreat, because then we had the refugee issues, we have the Sahel to manage, and we now have all these very strong internal crises inside the EU also, and our relationship with the UK and Germany against to balance inside. So I don't think France is looking for very strong protagonism in the Middle East currently. And Lebanon is perceived more as a burden, if you want, currently.
Well, that's not good news for the Lebanese. The European don't care about us. No one loves us. The European, the French, the American, we are on our own. But Dorothy, you said something. You said that the sanctions are used by the American, you know, as part of the maximum pressure, because the Caesar is one of like the whole toolbox, which is the maximum pressure to regime change. You know, never the American said we want regime change. They said we need to change in behavior. But you know, are the Caesar are they? Is there, you know, Nick, you said it very clearly that Caesar Act looks at reconstruction, petroleum, everything that empowers the Assad regime. But could it have like not the stated objective that are not stated, that the Caesar Act will induce some change in Lebanon? Now, I'm not saying regime change, but that will help the Hirak, you know, the popular movement in its quest for change. Will the political elite be more like responsive now? Or don't you think it won't make a difference much?
So I think that, you know, this is a question that fundamentally the Lebanese will have to answer, because we are at an inflection point, it seems, in Lebanese history. You know, Dorothy's description of sort of Lebanon's relationship, the European and the French relationship with Lebanon, is very indicative of the conundrum that Lebanon finds itself in, which is that traditionally the sort of warmer partnerships that it's had have grown colder, and Lebanese society is divided. And there is something to be said that the protest movement that we saw in October, and that has, you know, continued with some COVID-19 disruptions is actually not something that came out of nowhere. We had popular pressure before. Some of that was triggered around, for example, the trash crisis that occurred several years back, which seems to have reemerged. What you're seeing now is the overload of the sort of system that was put in place both prior to Taif and now post-Taif. And now there's a legitimate question to be asked: is the environment that was developed in Lebanon politically and socio-politically done? And if it is done, what does the future of Lebanon look like? And I don't want to sound poetic, but when you have a society that has been organized around power sharing among elites, and elites that come from particular communities, and the society and the politics are organized around each of those communities having its power and its share in society, will it take a Gibran-esque reawakening among the Lebanese to actually change the society. Because we are at a point now, we take the broader aperture, there's been this sort of larger question that has emerged over the last decade is, are we seeing the deterioration of that post-World War I Sykes-Picot order? And Lebanon is a direct product, was directly created as a result of that post-World War I Sykes-Picot order. And Lebanon has sort of sustained itself over this last century. But we've now reached the culmination point of Lebanon and the system that was designed in that point after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, after World War I. And that's an open question. That can be an empowering question, because what that means then is the Lebanese people ultimately and fundamentally have to decide what their relationship is with each other. Lebanese people have to ask themselves, can they sustain a country that's dependent so much on imports? Can they sustain a country that, for all intents and purposes, serves as a forward deployed base for a powerful sub-state, or we could say quasi-state armed actor, Hezbollah, that there's an increase in international consensus against it and against sort of that whole security structure that's been ordered. So from that context, the Caesar sanctions do apply another pressure point. But I agree with William and Dorothy that fundamentally the challenges that Lebanon faces are the result of the Lebanese system. And this is an inflection point in Lebanese history. And there is a pathway whereby Lebanon ceases to exist. And I know from engaging with Lebanese friends and colleagues, there's this increasing sense, never mind in the diaspora, those who have left, but those who are there and who remain, that it's over. And that there has to be something new, or the collapse will be so horrific that millions of people will suffer.
Thank you. You know what? You touched on a very important point, because there is a narrative that's ongoing, that's panning out, that the Caesar Act, purpose is to impoverish Lebanese people. And we know that's not true, because as you three of you have said, it's the system has been corrupt for 30 years. And as Dorothy said, it's like the last nail in the coffin of economic corrupt system that's been going on for 30 years. I want to ask you now, what would you recommend? What would you recommend? First of all, how do you see this going? And I want an answer from all of you. How do you see this going in the future, in the medium future? And what do you suggest? What would be your recommendation? Nick, we start with you.
My recommendation may seem broad and sweeping, but fundamentally, the society that has been developed, the socio-political order in Lebanon, in my opinion, has come to its culmination point. And there are massive issues. And they start with corruption, they start with infrastructure. The ongoing negotiations for the IMF bailout, $10 billion bailout, are just one sort of very small step on that road. And the very fundamental demand of that negotiation is there has to be genuine reform. Dorothy talked about this. Lebanon at the moment is a country that's dependent on the international community and the international economic system to sustain itself. It needs to be able, first of all, to get some time and space. So those reforms need to be engaged in. But beyond that, it may be time now for the system to change. And that's going to be a bottom-up led approach. So fundamentally, the Lebanese people will need to be given a greater say, and then the system that Lebanon has designed will need to change.
Okay, so you say that the popular movement now needs to continue to instigate a change.
Yes, I believe so, because I do not see this change coming from the top down. All previous efforts to institute change in Lebanon have been top down, and they have failed.
William, what do you say on that? How do you see it going? How do you see the future in Lebanon from now? Because you were talking about, when we were talking about the report that was given in the Congress, in the Republican committee, and you were saying we should worry about it, because even now, if the State Department and the Pentagon are really keen on keeping the aid to Lebanon, on keeping the aid to the left, this might change in 5 years from now. How do you see the Lebanon 5 years from now?
Yeah, I think Nicholas had it right. It all depends on the choices that the Lebanese leaders and influenced by the Lebanese public make in the interim 5 years. One thing I do want to caveat a little bit is something that you said, where you said nobody cares, about, no one in Europe, no one in America cares
No one
about.
cares about us.
Actually, I don't think that that's true. I think they care in a different way. I mean, just look at this IMF. The IMF has a multi-billion-dollar bailout sitting on the table for Lebanon.
And said it before it. We still didn't take the money from said because we didn't do any of the reforms.
Exactly. There are literally scores of countries around the world that would love to be in Lebanon's position, that would want nothing more than to get such a bailout from the IMF and would do whatever it takes to get that bailout. The rest of the world is actually showing Lebanon with a great degree of unanimity that it really cares about Lebanon. It wants Lebanon to succeed. It wants Lebanon to be sovereign. It wants Lebanon to have a functional economy. And it is willing to put a lot of money against that, if and only if the Lebanese leadership is willing to take the steps necessary. As Nicholas said, it's the first in many steps necessary in order to become the country that the Lebanese people want it to be. And so you ask, where is Lebanon going to be in 5 years? If it's starting to take that path, if it's moving, it's going to be very, very difficult. But if it's moving that direction, I think Lebanon is going to find a lot of support and a lot of help from the international community. If it continues to refuse to do so, if it does what I said at the beginning, if it makes the worst choices and looks east and ignores Caesar and refuses to cooperate, refuses to reform, then it's only going to get worse. And the really horrific outcomes we can all imagine very easily, and those are not entirely implausible.
Well, William, thank you. I have 2 points here because the Caesar, it's about relationship with the Assad regime. Yeah, but then the IMF and the Caesar have nothing to do with the Assad regime. It has to do with the reforms. So we have two things here. We have, we have the Caesar, which is a relation with a regime that's no longer viewed favorably in the international community and is rendered accountable. And you have internal reforms so it has to do both, you think?
It does, and those are two issues, and there's multiple more issues, but they are also related. They're related in the fact that what the decisions that Lebanese policymakers have made regard to Syria have not really been about Lebanon. Hezbollah presented itself for decades as the primary defender of, and the only potential defender of Lebanese sovereignty against the threat from the south from Israel. At the call of Iran and Assad, Hezbollah sent huge numbers of fighters across the border that had nothing to do with Lebanese sovereignty, had nothing to do with protecting Lebanon. In fact, has made the situation in Lebanon significantly worse. If Hezbollah was actually interested in protecting Lebanon, it would never have taken the steps that it did. So that's why these things are connected, because what they're connected is in a dysfunctional political system where political elites led by Hezbollah are taking actions not for the overall benefit of the Lebanese people, but for the overall benefit of themselves, their sort of feudal networks, and their ideological objectives. And that's the fundamental problem that traces through all of these disparate issues. And
do you see this either act if they really feel the heat, because the economy is collapsing? Do you think they might reconsider the relation with the Assad regime? I mean, at the end, do you think there is a chance for that happening?
I think if the Lebanese people make it clear that the current status quo can't continue, then the status quo will not continue. Now, will it completely flip a switch and go 180 degrees in the other direction? Probably not. That's not how the world works. But these things can be limited in significant ways that can have a real world effect. and the government can demonstrate not only communicate, but can demonstrate its intent to be walking in that direction for the next 5 years. And that's the way that the government will get support from the international community. Again, right now, at present, it seems to be the opposite direction. Right now, they go to Brussels and they say, please save us, Europe, to a Europe that is both not inclined and not capable of doing so. That's not a serious approach to the issue. That's an issue that's designed around the political impact of saying such a thing at home. So Lebanese leaders need to get serious about all of these issues and make the hard decisions that have been before them for a long period of time, but are now, as Nicholas says, potentially coming to a real inflection point where they can't be put off any longer. They can't be hoped that someone else will save them. They can't hope for a deus ex machina to change the narrative.
Okay. Dorothy, what do you think? What do you think? What would be your recommendation?
I think, of course,
how do you think things going?
You have 2 points. Like, first you have to fix the economy, then you have to fix the institutions, and both of these are needed to restore trust. In order to fix the economy, I think, of course, the IMF provides the right frame, even if it's considered as, abdicating things to, external powers, etc. There are rules, and it gives money against rules. And if you just look at Greece, how the reforms were conducted in Greece post the big financial crisis, I think it's a very good example. They went for a very democratic process. They had a left-wing government who had to implement very hard reforms. But now I think Greece has come out of the crisis, basically. So it's possible if you take time, if you're serious about it, and if you have an externally monitored by accountable institutions, and not only random political allies. So don't play around, don't look for free money outside, because nobody's going to save you again for nothing, for free. So you have to go more national. You have to make Lebanon a state, and that's about the institutions. And I think one important point, when I heard you discussing about the armed forces, I mean, the LAF is not the only institution that matters in Lebanon. The judiciary, I think, has a very important part to play as well. You have to bring people to accountability. All the people who've smuggled money outside of Lebanon, especially when the crisis went worse in the last months, you have to have the judiciary process coming to an end. You have to have people made responsible for what they did. That's very important. This works in every, reconciliation process that we have, like post-civil wars in the world. You have commissions where people come around the table and they have to admit that, they made mistakes. This is not like blaming people, sending them to hell. This is like, you have to take your share of the responsibility of what's been done, because otherwise there's no example. Nobody's showing the right way, the right path. So I think the judiciary is very important for the future in order to make trust in the Lebanese institution become, more stable, I think. So, of course, the protest movement is still important, like having people on the street, claiming for more, democracy, etc., and going for a sort of pseudo-united, sittings on the streets, etc. And then in any incident occurs, like the COVID-19, which is a big incident, okay, people are brought back home by force. And then now everybody is expecting them to come out again, but what for? I mean, at some point, people have to work together seriously, and you have to do it for yourself. Don't look for external solutions systematically, especially because with the big economic crisis that's looming post-COVID-19, the post-globalization context, what are the assets of Lebanon? The financial system, the banking system is totally collapsed, has totally collapsed. So where's the money going to come from? From the diaspora? Do you think the Lebanese are going to put their money in the Lebanese banks again? I don't think so for the next years to come. Do you see any money coming from the Gulf? The Gulf countries are going to need the money for themselves. They made it very clear. So you will have to count on yourself. So, okay, you are being impoverished for some time. You have to equalize this inside the country, make everybody participate to the effort. And, you know, seen from the outside, it's so strange to see a country that's not a big country. I mean, in terms of superficie, of population, etc.
5 million people.
Exactly. 5 million people should be able to get together if they want to show that Lebanon is a nation state and that it's holding together.
Thank you, Dorothy. Very strong punching line. Dorothy, since Dorothy now we
look at Greece. Very important in terms of.
Now we start our questions, and since Miss Dorothy will be leaving soon in 5 minutes, anyone of the audience who have questions for Miss Dorothy, send them now. We have one question actually for you, and it's about not directly related to not to Caesar, but since you are an expert in Turkey, it's about Turkey, and it's about Turkey's role in Lebanon. We have seen recently a huge media campaign on Turkey, saying that Turkey is interfering in Lebanon internal affairs. So how do you evaluate that? Is it true? Is it exaggerated?
I think, again, Lebanon is just a symbolic battlefield for other, you know, struggles that are going on between some Gulf countries and Turkey. The Saudis are very crossed. They're very angry at the Turks. The UAE are extremely angry at the Turks. So they're going for massive propaganda. I don't think Turkey is extremely active in Lebanon. I don't think it has any point of, you know, of influence, any specific community that they can refer to and count on, and that would consolidate, that would bolster their influence regionally. I think the Turks are bothering a lot with what they're doing in the north of Syria, and what they want is basically the EU to help them consolidate their presence in the zones that they're occupying in the north of Syria. And I don't think they have time to bother about Lebanon very much. So they're already engaged heavily in Libya, and these are two battlefronts that they have to do with on a really at a high level currently. So again, Lebanon is only a theater where the confrontation between some Gulf countries and Turkey is taking place, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a question, two questions from the audience. One, how can Lebanon manage to coordinate with the President's Syrian regime in solving the refugee issue under Caesar Act? Who would like to take this question?
I'm happy to take this question. The Caesar Act does nothing to prevent normal diplomatic conversations about issues of mutual concern, such as refugees. It does certainly nothing to prevent humanitarian goods from going forward. That's very explicitly carved out in the Caesar Act. And of course, the US government has not done any follow-on designations to the Caesar Act, which is again what actually puts it into force, that would in any way prevent the Lebanese regime from having those conversations with the Lebanese government having conversations with the Assad regime. The issue is about support to the Assad, material support to the Assad's regime's ability to continue to commit war crimes. And continue to do military activities. Those are very different questions.
Yeah, because also there is the issue of aid that's going to Assad. So, because now it's under scrutiny, this aid, because it's when it goes to the refugee, it goes through Assad. And also there is the issue, how can we, if you want to send them back, they need the aid. So that's the issue, I think, to be discussed. Do you think it will
these are eminently solvable and addressable issues, both in the context of the law and the context of practices on sanctions, if one is trying to approach it actually to solve the humanitarian issues. What unfortunately happens quite often, and we've already seen it in Syria, we've seen it in a number of other cases, is that the very regime that you're criticizing because of their lack of interest in humanitarian issues, or lack of interest in human rights, their committing of war crimes, has already proved that they actually don't really put a high value on these kind of humanitarian issues, and they would use the humanitarian issue as a tool to accomplish what they feel as their larger geopolitical objectives. And so therefore we're seeing both the Assad regime and Russia to take every step that they possibly can to make sure that humanitarian goods are pushed through the regime so that they can siphon off, so that they can benefit from it, instead of actually addressing the humanitarian issues at place. This is not uncommon at all. We saw Saddam Hussein did it. The Iranians are doing it now. The North Koreans do it all the time. Countries that actually don't put a high value on human rights will very easily subordinate human rights to their other objectives. And so if they were actually trying to address the humanitarian issues, these are relatively easy to do. The issues become in when they're not really trying to address the humanitarian issues.
I just want to weigh in very quickly to build off all these excellent points that William raises. One dynamic that I think is very important is that the Caesar sanctions put an emphasis on transparency. So, we've seen this, that when it comes to the United Nations process, the U.S. has engaged as an honest partner here with other Security Council nations. We saw this recently with the discussions about open border points for humanitarian access to various areas of Syria, which resulted in one border point in northern Syria being opened. The U.S. hasn't necessarily stood in the way of UN funneled support for refugees. In fact, the United States is by far the world's most generous donor to efforts to support humanitarian efforts to address the Syrian refugee crisis. I think that one of the interesting dynamics we see here with the Caesar sanctions is we talk about reconstruction, we talk about real estate. Some of the entities that have been sanctioned, like the Shem Holding Company, which runs Marata City, and some of these other sort of high-end luxury developments that are around Damascus that literally are sought to be built on areas where people used to live, that were targeted deliberately by the regime, that were destroyed, which led to internal displacement, which led to refugee flows into neighboring nations such as Lebanon. And so there is this interesting, nuanced discussion that should be had, I believe, about, how in this iterative process, we have to emphasize, the Caesar sanctions, as William pointed out, are a tool. And there's an iterative process as you figure out the instructions on how to utilize this tool. Medicine, for example, humanitarian assistance aren't targeted by Caesar. There's an emphasis on transparency. If you want to support the Syrian refugee population in Lebanon, there should be a transparent process by which there's some question as to whether that support could somehow support the regime, be transparent about it. So those questions are answered. And I think, but just fundamentally and strategically, when we look at the intended effect is for the regime to change its behavior. Because if the regime changes its behavior, it no longer serves as a threat to neighboring nations, it no longer serves as a threat to its own people, and it holds accountable those who committed human rights abuses and war crimes. There is a process by which you can then begin to support people coming back into their country. So I think fundamentally we need to emphasize that Caesar doesn't make it more complicated for humanitarian assistance to help refugees in Lebanon or promote the return of refugees that seek to do so back to Syria. It's the regime's behavior and the continued syndocracy of regime war profiteers, which includes the presidential family itself, that prevent this from happening, prevent the refugee crisis from being ameliorated, and prevent Syrians that want to do so to return.
Yeah, because there is the issue, for example, recently the Lebanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs took a decision regarding the return of the refugee that they want to facilitate. And then the Assad regime would say, oh, how can I take them back? But there's a Caesar. I cannot reconstruct, I cannot rebuild their homes, I cannot rebuild the sewage system, etc., etc.
I just want to build off that point. Syria, prior to the conflict, had an affordable housing crisis. The regime has destroyed whole areas where people that were internal economic migrants from underserviced areas of Syria went to these major cities such as Damascus, such as Aleppo, such as Homs. They destroyed these areas. And in places in Damascus, they want to rebuild it with luxury real estate. They want to use, so rather than create a blueprint and a vision that would support sort of a return for people, and an affordable return for people, and return for people that was better than they experienced prior to the conflict, the regime has blueprints for these luxury real estate developments on destroyed land that benefits just a very narrow core of the regime elite.
So you don't think the Caesar has anything to do with the issue of return? It will not affect the return. It will not affect the return.
The Caesar sanctions, if they have the intended effect of being one of the tools that changes the regime's behavior in an iterative process with other concerned global powers, such as Russia, can actually facilitate creating the conditions that would allow those Syrians refugees who want to return, as well as those Syrian internally displaced that want to return. But this is all part of a UN-led process. Fundamentally, the Caesar sanctions are supporting a U.S. efforts to use the UN process through Security Council Resolution 2254 to create the conditions for a sustainable end for the conflict, which would then allow for a pathway for Syrians to return to their country.
Okay, thank you, Nick. I have another question. What is the role, I mean, maybe William will take this question, about the GCC in the financial bailout. You know, Dorothy said, the Gulf need their own money. They will not give you any money. But wouldn't be any sort of bailout, because we always look at the Gulf when we want to bail out.
Right. I think sadly Dorothy is correct on this. The Gulf countries, it varies depending on country to country, but all have great challenges right now, and all have very significant foreign policy objectives in other countries, of which are costing money already right now. So it's unlikely, I would think, in the current environment that the GCC will be, yet another, source for Lebanese to hope that someone else will solve their problems. I think that they could be part of the solution if Lebanon starts taking the steps that are being requested of the wider international community. They could be part of that support, either through the IMF or more likely in support of an IMF package and in support of the kinds of reforms that are needed. But to simply be able to simply give money without requiring changes, I don't see that as likely to happen. In fact, I see depending on which GCC country you're talking about, I would imagine that some of their requirements of reform would be even larger and more difficult to accomplish than some of the ones that are being asked by the IMF right now.
Because the president, I have also another question that came. I was like, what about Iraq, Oman, Kuwait, and particularly, because recently our president have sent as an emissary, Abbas Ibrahim, to Kuwait and to Qatar to try to get some support for Lebanon. So do you think it will materialize? You don't think it will materialize in anything?
I don't think so. I don't think that it is certainly not going to materialize in the time or scale that would be able to address the deep problems that Lebanon faces right now.
So we have no one but ourselves to start with. That's what Nick, what Dorothy said.
I think that's exactly right. And and again, I do want to reinforce that I think that Lebanon has a lot of friends out there in the world that, notwithstanding the wider coronavirus, notwithstanding the all the issues that we've talked about, are willing to put money up, are willing to put effort up and time, as you see in the billions of dollars that are being put up from the IMF, but they're not willing to put it up in the absence of such reforms. Yeah.
They need accountability.
That's right.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, William. Thank you, Nicholas. Dorothy already had to leave a few minutes before. Thank you. It was a very challenging discussion. Unfortunately, it's depressive because we don't see really anything good in the horizon. We don't see, but hopefully there will be change, as you said. We will push for change, the people will push for change, and hopefully if there is change, there is a better future. So thank you very much, and thank you for our audience for listening to us, and bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.